Hey there everyone, my name is Dan Camelon and I am the Strength Coach Tutor. Today we're going to go over anatomy terminology to discuss terms that you'll likely see when you're learning human movement, kinesiology, and muscle origins, insertion, actions, and their names in themselves. So let's go ahead and get started. So planes of motion. So all the joints in our body move to some degree, either 1 to 3 of these planes of movement. So we have the sagittal, the frontal, and the transverse plane. So the first one we have here is the sagittal, and that divides our body into left and right halves. And in terms of movements that occur in the sagittal plane, imagine a piece of glass that's directly on both sides of your body. You have a piece on your left, you have a piece on your right, and it only allows you to go frontwards and backwards. All right, so pretty much any movement that involves flexion and extension. So if you're looking at squats, deadlifts, RDLs, bicep curls, tricep pushdowns, dumbbell front raises, calf raises, doing plantar flexion, dorsiflexion at your ankle. All of those movements are front to back movements, and therefore they are going to occur in the sagittal plane. And to also give you a frame of reference, all of these movements are occurring from a standpoint of starting in the anatomical position, right? So unless something says otherwise, where like you're starting in a position of 90 degrees of abduction at the shoulder and then you're moving, then that's a different story. But otherwise, all of these movements are occurring in a reference in terms of the anatomical position. Next, we have the frontal plane. This divides our body into anterior and posterior halves. So in this case, imagine you have a piece of glass directly in front of you and a piece of glass directly behind you, and you can only move side to side. So most commonly, we see the movements that we see here are abduction and adduction, which we're going to see at the shoulder and the hip. We can also see radial and ulnar deviation at the wrist, and we will see inversion and eversion at the ankle. Last one there is also lateral flexion of the torso. So if you're doing like dumbbell lateral flies for your shoulder, any type of hip abduction for your glute medius at the hip, things of that nature, that's where you're going to see movements and exercises performed in the frontal plane. In the transverse plane is the hardest plane for us to control as human beings, because this is where a lot of our rotation occurs, and those sort of movements are the hardest for us to control. So if you're looking at like sport-specific examples, if you're swinging a baseball bat, a golf swing, doing like a Russian twist type of exercise, wood choppers, those are all pretty common examples where we see a lot of trunk rotation, and those sort of movements are going to occur in the transverse plane. Again, starting in the anatomical position, if we do internal and external rotation of the shoulder and the hip, that we're going to see that occur in the transverse plane, as well as pronation and supination of the forearm. All right, so let's go ahead and take this, go down and go plane by plane to really discuss every movement that's occurring in each of these planes. So if we look at the sagittal plane, we have flexion and extension like we mentioned before. So if I'm looking at my shoulders, right? Flexion is bringing my shoulder directly forward in front of me all the way up, and then extension is bringing it back down. Hyperextension is the point where if my arm's straight by the side of my body and then my arm goes behind my body, that would be hyperextension. Elevation and depression, that refers to the scapula, which is going up and down. All right, so elevation is shrugging my shoulders up, and depression is bringing them down. Anterior and posterior pelvic tilts. So typically speaking, especially if you see someone squat and they have a nice, really large, big curvature in their low back, not necessarily excessive, but we want a curvature there to protect our spine. But typically you're going to see that pelvis tilt forward in order to help us get into that lordotic position, if you will, to protect our spine. Posterior pelvic toe is where someone presents with themselves with like a flat low back, if you will, or they tuck your pelvis underneath you and you contract your glutes and your abs and almost like sucking your stomach almost. That's when we do a posterior pelvic tilt, where all of it shifts or pulls backwards. And then plantar flexion is when we go up on our toes, or as if we're stepping on the gas pedal, doing a calf raise. And then dorsiflexion is if our foot is flat on the ground and then we bring your foot up but keep our heel on the ground, or we're bringing our toes closer to our shin. That would be an example of dorsiflexion. The greatest variety of movements that we can see here, where flexion extension occurs most commonly. We're going to see that with flexion and extension. So we see flexion and extension at the shoulder, the neck, the elbow, the wrist, the hip, the knee. All right, so all in the trunk. There's a lot of different joints that we're going to see perform flexion and extension. All right, next up is the frontal plane. So we talked about before about abduction and adduction, right? So if we look at this guy here doing the pull-up, he started in a position of full abduction with his arms overhead, and now he's trying to go into a more adducted position where his upper arm is attempting to get closer to the side of his body. Downward and upward rotation occur with abduction and adduction. So in this position, right, he's in a more of an adducted position. So that means you're going to more of a downwardly rotated position where we can see this bottom tip of the scapula. That's the inferior angle. As this comes down towards and closer to the spine, that movement there is downward rotation. And in the process of where our arms go up and above our head with abduction, and the inferior angle of the scapula starts here and then goes outward, that's upward rotation. Radial deviation and ulnar deviation occur at the wrist. Radial deviation is when my thumb moves closer to my radius or the thumb side of my forearm, and ulnar deviation is when my pinky moves closer to my ulna, and so therefore that's ulnar deviation. Lateral flexion is pretty much what's going to occur at the spine, and that's essentially doing side bending, or any type of like doing like a side crunch, or any type of, again, side bending is where we're going to see lateral flexion, and that's occurring at the trunk. Inversion and eversion occurs at the ankle. So inversion is typically the most common way in which we sprain our ankles, and so that way, or what's happening there, is when the bottom of our foot rolls inwards, or where the bottom of our foot faces the other foot. All right. Eversion is the opposite of that, where the bottom of our foot ends up facing away from the rest of our body. Okay, and lastly here we're going to talk about the transverse plane. So movements, first off, include internal and external rotation. So usually internal rotation is when our ball and socket joints, which are our hip and our shoulder, roll inwards. External rotation when those ball and socket joints roll outwards or away from everything else. Protraction and retraction involves the scapula. So protraction is when our shoulder blades roll forward on the rib cage, and retraction is when we squeeze them backwards towards one another and closer to the spine. Horizontal adduction is what the gentleman here in the picture is doing in the process of bringing his hands closer together. That process of, arms wide apart to hands close together, that's horizontal adduction. And then horizontal abduction is bringing your arms when they're close together like this and then spreading them apart. So horizontal adduction, imagine you're doing like a chest fly like this. Horizontal abduction, imagine you're doing like a reverse deltoid fly or a band pull apart. That would be an example of doing or performing horizontal abduction. Pronation, supination occur at the forearm. It's easiest to see when our elbows are flexed to 90 degrees. It is a little bit harder to tell if our arms are down by our side. If your elbows are flexed to 90 degrees and your palms are facing upwards, that's supination. If your palms are facing downward, that is pronation. If your thumbs are pointing straight up, that's called a neutral position. If your arms are down by your sides and there's 0 degrees of elbow flexion, then to do pronation is more like almost as if you're going to use an overhand grip, and then supination is going to be an underhand grip. All right. Then lastly is trunk rotation, which we were talking about before when we mentioned the transverse plane, where if you're like you're doing any sort of rotation movement at the trunk, whether it's swinging a baseball, doing like a Russian twist or a wood chopper exercise, those are going to be examples of trunk rotation. All right, now let's go over different types of muscle contractions. All right, so these are really important terms for you guys to be able to understand when it comes to preparing for your exam and just to be able to apply in the real world as well. So the first one is isometric muscle contraction. So isometric means that you're performing a muscle contraction, but there's no change in the length of the muscle. And therefore, that you're not producing any joint movement, you're not moving anywhere. So your muscle's working, but you're not moving. So you're probably wondering, okay, how does this work? So typically exercises that don't involve any movement, such as a wall sit or a plank, those are going to be examples of isometric contractions, or where an isometric contraction is involved, right? So if I'm doing a wall sit and you're holding it for an extended period of time, your muscles are going to burn, your quads are going to burn. Your muscles are working, they have to be able to still produce force to hold you in that position, but they're not producing any movement. Same idea if like you're doing like a quote pause rep in the middle of a repetition or in a set, that would be an example. At that time, you were doing an isometric contraction. All right, so next is isotonic. So isotonic means is that you're performing muscle contractions where the external resistance or the load is staying the same. And so therefore you're going through concentric and eccentric contractions. So concentric is when the muscle is shortening, eccentric is when the muscle is lengthening. Isokinetic, let me go back to isotonic here for a second. So isotonic, for using barbells, dumbbells, kettlebells, anything where the load or the resistance is staying the same, that's going to be an example of isotonic muscle contractions. Lastly, we have isokinetics. So isokinetic means we're performing exercise at the same speed, all right? So typically this involves very expensive equipment in order to scientifically be able to move at the same speed throughout the entire range of motion. And typically when we use these expensive machines, it's measured in degrees per second. The higher that degrees per second, the faster that you're moving. This lower the degrees per second, say if you're moving 30, 50, even 10 degrees per second, that's very slow, all right? So again, the higher that number, the faster that you're moving. Sometimes we try and replicate this by adding bands or chains, right? Because as typically we get closer to the end of our range of motion, we tend to be a little bit stronger. And so therefore we move faster at that point. Where we try to accommodate that, we do quote accommodating resistance, where we add bands or chains to offset the enemy and try and teach us to keep the same speed of contraction throughout the range of motion. All right, a muscle's role during exercise. So whenever you're doing any exercise or any movement, there's an agonist, an antagonist, and a synergist. So an agonist is the primary mover of that exercise or that movement. So for example, if I'm doing a bench press, right, our pectoralis major is going to be the agonist. If I'm doing a dumbbell curl, the biceps brachii is going to be the agonist. The antagonist is the muscle directly opposite of the agonist, and therefore you're not using it at all during this exercise. So for example, if I'm doing the barbell bench press example, the antagonist would be your posterior deltoid. That does the exact opposite of the pectoralis major. All right, if I'm doing a dumbbell bicep curl, the antagonist for that would be your triceps brachii. Now the synergist, you can think of as the agonist's little helper. It's going to perform the same action. It's going to help us out a bit, but it's not going to be the muscle that's primarily responsible for performing or executing that movement. So with the barbell bench press example, the synergist would be the anterior deltoid. You could also put triceps brachii because we're also doing or using those muscles during that exercise. With the dumbbell bicep curl, the brachialis, which is a smaller muscle underneath the biceps brachii that also performs elbow flexion, that muscle would help us perform a dumbbell bicep curl, so therefore it would be a synergist. All right, so again, providing context with muscle action. So when we discuss a muscle action, it is in the context of a concentric action, muscle contraction. So what I mean by that, so say if I'm doing a dumbbell bicep curl, I'm going to be using my biceps brachii. And we know that the biceps brachii performs elbow flexion, and that's the movement that I'm doing when I perform a dumbbell bicep curl. Now, that's a concentric phase, right? If I'm talking about the biceps brachii doing elbow flexion, that's in the context of a concentric muscle contraction. If we look at things eccentrically, the biceps brachii is responsible for eccentric elbow extension, right? And that's the opposite direction in which we typically think of the biceps brachii. And that's because we're doing an eccentric contraction, therefore things are lengthening, and that's going to be in the opposite direction. So same idea if I'm doing, if I'm looking at the pectoralis major, during the bench press, concentrically, it's going to do horizontal adduction. Eccentrically, it's going to be responsible for horizontal abduction. All right. So if you ever asked a question or have to think of things in terms of, okay, eccentrically, what is this muscle doing during this exercise? It's the opposite movement in which we normally think of its action. All right. All right. Next several slides here, we have a lot of different terms to go over. And these terms are just to familiarize yourselves. And so when you learn about anatomy, you learn about different muscles, different body parts, different exercises, and so forth, you're familiar with these terms. So really straightforward here, right? So the axilla refers to our armpit. Brachial refers to the upper arm, so right where our humerus is. Calcaneal refers to our heel, which is actually you can't really see in this picture here because it's hidden by the foot. Carpal is our wrist, where you see these bunch of little bones here, and then the distal ends of our radius and ulna. Cervical is in our neck here. Cubital refers to the elbow. Dorsal is the backside of something, so essentially, like when we think about our spine, like that's the backside of us, or like you usually think of like a dolphin or a shark that has a dorsal fin. It's that fin is on its backside. It's on its dorsal side. Femoral typically refers to the femur or the thigh. The term hallux or hallucus refers to the big toe, so the biggest toe right here. Lumbar, of course, refers to the low back. Metacarpal is hand, and then metatarsal is foot. So look at the difference there, right? So carpal, tarsal. So anytime you see carpal, that's going to refer to the hand. Anytime you see tarsal, that's going to refer to the foot. Reason being is that those little bones right here in the wrist and hand, those are our carpal bones. And then these little bones that you see down here in the foot, those are our tarsal bones, okay? But the metacarpal bones, these longer bones coming off of those carpal bones, those are the metacarpals. And then the longer, skinnier bones coming off of those tarsal bones are the metatarsals. Next, we have the pectoral region, which is going to be, of course, the chest. Peroneal is going to be the lateral lower leg. So right where our fibula is, the skinny bone on the lateral aspect of our lower leg, that's going to be the peroneals. Plantar refers to the bottom of the foot. Pollex or pollicis refers to the thumb. Popliteal refers to the back of the knee, or the posterior aspect of the knee. Tarsal refers to the ankle. Thoracic refers to the chest and really the rib cage itself. Ventral is the front side, so that would essentially be the opposite of dorsal. And then volar refers to the palm of the hand. Okay, so let's go over more directional terms. Those are more anatomical terms. Now we're going to talk about directional terms. And using these terms gives you a frame of reference when you compare from one thing to another, what direction do you need to go in, essentially. So first off, we have distal and proximal. So distal means something is further away from the center of mass, and proximal means something is closer to the center of mass. So let's compare my center of mass would be right here, right where about my umbilicus is, or my belly button. So if we're going to compare distal and proximal, it's right, my shoulder is more proximal to my center of mass compared to my elbow. My elbow is more distal compared to my shoulder when looking at the center of mass, right? Because the elbow is farther away compared to the shoulder. Now, superior and inferior really refers to above and below. So really it's kind of similar premise with the shoulder, right? The shoulder is going to be superior to the elbow is inferior to the shoulder. But we can do the same thing here with the ankle and the knee, right? The ankle is inferior to the knee is superior to the ankle. Now, next we have deep and superficial. So deep means something is further away from the surface of the skin. Superficial means something is very close to the surface of the skin. So for example, bones are deep, right? We have to go through our skin, all of our muscle and fat, etc., in order to get to bone. So bone's gonna be pretty deep. Superficial, as close as you can get to the skin, that's the more superficial it'll be. Dorsal and palmar refer to the back of the hand or back of the body. Palmar is palm of the hand. Plantar, we talked about before, is the bottom of the foot. Anterior is going to be anything on the front surface of the body. So everything that you pretty much see here, that's going to be the anterior surface. If I did a 180 with the skeleton, everything on the back side would be posterior. Okay, so again, everything you see in that picture there is anterior. Excuse me. Everything you see there is anterior. If you turn the skeleton around, everything that you can see would be posterior. last two here are medial and lateral. So medial means something is closer to the midline of the body. So meaning if I drew a line straight down the middle of the body, divide it in left and right halves, if it was closer to that midline, that means it's closer. That means it would be medial. If something is farther away from the midline, that means it would be lateral, right? So let's compare my tibia and my fibula, right? So if I'm looking at the midline of the body here, my tibia is going to be more medial than my fibula. My fibula is more lateral than my tibia, right? Because my fibula is going to be a bit farther away. Let's look, same idea here with our radius and ulna, right? So my radius, I'm sorry, this is my ulna here. So my ulna is more medial compared to the radius. My radius is more lateral compared to my ulna, all right? All right, guys, so that is it in terms of anatomical terms. I hope you guys were able to get some value out of this. I hope presenting these terms and definitions gave you some context, and again, keep bridging some gaps in terms when you're trying to learn and understand anatomy. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out at any of my social media channels at The Strength Coach Tutor. You can also go to my website, thestrengthcoachtutor.com, to learn about my services that I provide. Thanks, guys.